So living away from home allowance, how does it work? Well, the benefit of this was that if you are living away from home, and it could be, I come from the UK and I work in Australia for 4 years, my employer could pay for a whole array of benefits. The main benefit was accommodation costs. So in this example here, you can see that the accommodation cost of $52,000 comes straight off the gross wage to work out the tax. Fantastic benefit and one of the biggest perks, I believe, in fringe benefits tax. Government didn't like it. Now, they introduced some measures, and we've got a strange, it's a bit of a compliance issue for employers, because the measures came into effect on a particular date, which is literally halfway through the FBT year. So you may have situations where you're entitled to these concessions and you've got to work out your fringe benefits tax, and in the latter part of the year you may not be eligible for any FBT exemption. Now, with the living away from home allowance, it's very, very difficult now if you're from overseas. We've got overseas employees that come to Australia to work. It's going to be very, very difficult to get that benefit. And one of the changes, you see a lot of press recently about these 457 visa holders. These are the sponsorship visas. They're the ones that I believe that are really feeling the pinch here with these living away from home allowances, because they're pretty much next to impossible trying to get. So I'll go through how the law was passed. The effective start date is 1 October 2012. If you have non-resident employees that are on these 457 visas, you may find that that is your critical date. And if you provide any of these living away from home allowances, then you may be subject to fringe benefits tax. Step number 1, what I would be doing if you have any employees in this category, is go to the contract. Have a look at the contract and see, does the contract state that I, as the employer, will provide Joe Bloggs a house while he's out here working? Because you may find then that you're stuck with this benefit and you may be now funding the fringe benefits tax on this benefit. So always have a look at the contract to see if there is a clause in that contract that states that if fringe benefits tax does apply, it's part of the package of the employee. Otherwise, it may cost the employer quite a bit of money. So what are how do these changes work? In order for the living away from home allowance to be an exempt benefit, number 1, you need to maintain a home in Australia. So if you use that UK person, the UK person comes to Australia, let's say they set up home in Melbourne. So they must have an interest in that home in Melbourne, or let's just say we just have someone who lives in Melbourne. They have an interest in that home, and an interest can be a long-term lease on the property, it can be an ownership interest in the property. So they live there, reside there in Melbourne, and they move away from that home for a period of no more than 12 months to carry out a job. So their employer might move them interstate, and they carry out that job. In that situation there, you would be entitled to the living away from home allowance. There was talk about bringing the living away from home allowance into like an allowance that goes on the group certificate, and you have to claim all your expenses in your return, but it's not the case, it's still fringe benefits tax. It's very hard to get, and that's why it's going to be very difficult for your non-residents to get it, because they'll come from the UK straight to their designated point where they're going to actually carry out their services, and it's very difficult in that respect because they have not maintained a home. If you live at home with your parents, if you've got employees that live at home with their parents and they're required to go from Sydney to Brisbane, they won't be able to get the living away from home allowance because they don't have an ownership interest in that property. If I have a home in Sydney and I've got a tenant in there, I split the cost and I have a tenant in there. If I move away from that home in Sydney to go to Brisbane, that's okay, provided I don't put an additional tenant on to take my room while I'm away. So there's a few quirks to the rules, but definitely worth investigating because the benefits can be substantial. And I've got, for the purposes of the slides, I have some information there about maintaining a home. It says no subletting, but you can have it sublet out for the existing room that's already in place. So it's pretty much the end of the living away from home allowances. However, there were also some provisions for fly-in, fly-out arrangements that are still applicable. But in certain situations, you will be entitled to get it. So how does it work? If you are entitled to a living away from home allowance, ordinarily the exempt components, so these are the items that get reduced from the gross salary, would be your accommodation costs and food costs. Accommodation has to be reasonable. There is no predetermined amount. If I'm an executive from BHP, maybe I'm on a lot of money and I can have the house down by the water at $3,000 a week. Yes.
What happens in a case where there's a husband and wife co-owning a residence?
Yep.
One of the partners goes away for, say, 6 months to a remote location. Are they entitled to the living away from home allowance?
Okay, if they're going to a remote location, you may find that there's a separate exemption. Yeah, but yeah, look, they have an ownership in the house. Look, one of the examples in the explanatory material stated that there was no family relationship, but when you actually go through the Act, there's nothing to state that that wouldn't apply, that you should be entitled to it. Yeah. So substantiation of expense. So your accommodation costs, your food costs are the big ones. Now, I'll just skip through these two ones. A lot of people thought when these rules came out that for those that were living away from home, everything went that we ordinarily package for people that lived away from home. However, relocation transport, the removal and storage of goods, leasing of goods, and education costs of the children, they're still there. You can still package these even though you're not classified as living away from home due to the new rules. Schooling for the children's a big one. I think that's up to the age of 25. You can pay for private education costs. If you're from overseas, it's customary in that industry that this is what happens when you come from overseas to work in Australia. Education costs can still be packaged, which is a great allowance there.
Does that include childcare?
Look, it has to be an educational institution. I'm not sure about the childcare, whether it meets one of the classifications, but ordinarily your private schooling, your primary schooling, your preschooling, it does include that. So that was a big change with living away from home allowances. Again, if you have any queries or concerns, just speak with your next year advisor. I'm sure they're all over these benefits.